Tonight, when the sun goes down, you are going to flip a switch. Light will flood the room and you won't think twice about it. You have done this thousands of times. It feels like the most natural thing in the world. But for 300,000 years, that switch did not exist. When the sun went down, the world went completely dark. Not dim, not quiet, completely, absolutely dark. And every single one of your ancestors spent roughly half of their entire life inside that darkness. The question most people ask is almost insultingly simple. What did they do? How did they pass the time? But that framing already tells you something about how far you've drifted from your own biology. Because the real question isn't what they did to fill the night. The real question is what the night was doing to them. And when you find out, you'll realize that what we replaced wasn't just inconvenience. We replaced an entire architecture of the human mind that took hundreds of thousands of years to build. Think about the last time the power went out at your home. Within minutes, something changed. The noise stopped, the artificial glow died, and in its place came something most people in the modern world almost never experience anymore. True, complete, unmediated darkness. And in that darkness, something strange started happening in your chest. A kind of quietness you couldn't quite name. Something that felt like relief and unease at the same time. That feeling has a history, a very long one. If this is already shifting how you see something you do every single night, subscribe and hit like. There's a lot more where this came from. Now, let's go deeper. Here's what historians, anthropologists, and sleep researchers have been slowly piecing together for decades, and what the picture looks like when you put all of it in the same frame. The pre-electric night was not empty. It was not a void people endured until morning came. It was a structured, active, psychologically rich portion of human life that operated by completely different rules than the day. And those rules shaped the human brain at a level we are only beginning to understand. Roger Ekirch, a historian at Virginia Tech who spent 16 years researching pre-industrial sleep, published his findings in a landmark 2001 paper in the American Historical Review and later expanded them into his book At Day's Close, Night in Times Past. What he found across thousands of historical documents, diaries, court records, medical texts, literature from medieval Europe, colonial America, ancient Rome, was something that modern sleep medicine had entirely missed. Before the electric light, virtually every human being on Earth slept in two distinct phases. Not one long block of sleep from 10 to 6. Two separate sleeps, with a period of wakefulness in between that lasted anywhere from 1 to 2 hours. They called it the first sleep and the second sleep. The gap between them had a name too, the watch, or the watching hour. And what did people do during that watching hour? This is where the historical record becomes extraordinary. They talked. Couples in the same bed would speak to each other in a way they rarely did during the day, more openly, more honestly, because the darkness and the hour stripped away the social performances that daylight demanded. Neighbors in shared sleeping quarters would hold quiet conversations. People prayed. Not the formal, structured prayer of church services, but something more private, more confessional. The kind of speaking to God that happens when there's no audience and no performance required. Some people used the watching hour to interpret the dreams they had just had, while they could still remember them. Medieval physicians specifically recommended this time for processing dreams, because the mind was considered uniquely receptive, somewhere between the sleeping and waking worlds. Others used it for sex. Historical demographers have noted that the watching hour appears to correlate with conception patterns in pre-industrial populations, which makes sense. It was a period of warmth, privacy, and physiological arousal, because the body naturally produces a surge of the hormone prolactin during the transition between the two sleep phases. It is not that people were setting aside time for intimacy. Their biology was engineering it for them, every single night. There was reading, in homes wealthy enough to have candles to spare. There was light domestic work, mending, spinning, tasks that didn't require daylight or full alertness. There was eating, a small meal from food kept near the hearth. And in farming communities, there was a practice almost no one talks about today. Rising in the deep dark of night to check on animals, to make small adjustments to the farm, to do the quiet labor that accumulated into survival. People did not experience this as hardship. It was simply the rhythm of the night, as natural and expected as waking at dawn. Robert Louis Stevenson, writing in the 1870s, described this wakefulness between sleeps as a kind of gift, a private hour that belonged entirely to the self. Doctors in the 16th and 17th centuries wrote prescriptions that specifically referenced the second sleep. If you have an ailment that requires rest, they would write, ensure it is attended to before the second sleep. The assumption embedded in that medical advice, that everyone knew what the second sleep was, tells you everything about how universal this experience was. And then, within the span of roughly one generation, it vanished entirely. The shift began in the late 19th century and accelerated through the early 20th. Thomas Edison's first commercial power station in Manhattan began operating in 1882. By the 1920s, electrical lighting had reached most urban centers in the United States and Western Europe. And with it came something that no human civilization had ever experienced before: the colonization of the night. The historian Wolfgang Schivelbusch documented this transformation in his book Disenchanted Night, showing how the electrification of public spaces changed not just visibility, but social behavior, economic patterns, and the psychological relationship between humans and darkness. Night became an extension of day. The pressure to remain productive did not stop at sunset anymore, and the two-phase sleep structure that had governed human rest for hundreds of thousands of years quietly collapsed. Not because it stopped working, but because the conditions that made it visible simply disappeared. Drop a comment below. Did you already suspect something was off about how you sleep, or did this completely blindside you? What Eckertsch's research revealed is not a curiosity from the pre-modern past. It is a diagnosis. Because the sleep that most people in the industrialized world practice today, the single consolidated block, the alarm clock, the lying awake at 2 in the morning unable to fall back asleep, is not the natural human sleep pattern. It is an adaptation. And it is an adaptation that is failing millions of people. Russell Foster, a neuroscientist at the University of Oxford who directs the Sleep and Circadian Neuroscience Institute, has spent decades studying what happens to the human brain when its circadian rhythms are disrupted. His research, along with a growing body of work from institutions including Harvard Medical School and the Max Planck Institute for Psychiatry in Munich, shows that the artificial extension of light into the night suppresses melatonin production, delays sleep onset, and fragments the architecture of sleep itself in ways that accumulate into serious health consequences over time. The list includes increased rates of depression, anxiety disorder, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and cognitive decline. This is not correlation. The mechanisms are understood at the cellular level. The blue spectrum light emitted by screens directly suppresses the retinal ganglion cells that signal the brain to begin sleep preparation. We are running a biological system built for the pre-electric world inside conditions it was never designed to operate in. But here's what makes this more than a sleep story. What we eliminated when we eliminated the watching hour was not just a resting period. We eliminated a category of consciousness. The state that existed between first and second sleep, the hypnopompic state, the threshold between sleep and waking, is neurologically distinct from both full sleep and full wakefulness. Electroencephalography studies show that the brain during this threshold period produces theta waves similar to deep meditation, combined with elevated activity in the prefrontal cortex. This is the state in which the brain integrates emotional experience, processes unresolved conflict, and generates the kind of nonlinear associative thinking that produces creative insight. The researchers Jerome Siegel at the University of California, Los Angeles, and Matthew Walker at UC Berkeley have both written extensively about the role of this transitional state in emotional regulation and memory consolidation. It is not a luxury, it is a function, and we abolished it. Not deliberately, not through any decision or policy, simply by making the night bright enough that the biological trigger for the watching hour, the depth of the first sleep, followed by the hormonal shift that produces wakefulness, was disrupted before it could fully express itself. The watching hour still tries to happen. That is what you are experiencing when you wake at 2 in the morning and lie there, unable to sleep, convinced that something is wrong with you. Nothing is wrong with you. Your body is executing an ancient program. The problem is that the program has no context to land in anymore. Instead of a warm hearth, a quiet conversation, a dream to interpret, you have a dark ceiling, a glowing phone screen, and the low-grade panic of someone who knows they have to be at work in 5 hours. We eliminated an entire phase of human consciousness. That quiet, reflective, liminal state doesn't exist as a cultural practice anymore for most people. Instead, we have insomnia, and we treat it like a disorder. If this made you see something you do every single night in a completely different way, subscribe so you don't miss what's next. Like the video if this is the kind of thing you want more of. There is a detail in Eckertsch's research that has stayed with scholars who study it. In the historical documents he examined, the watching hour was never described as loneliness. In diaries from medieval England, in court depositions from colonial New England, in the private correspondence of people separated by centuries and continents, the language used to describe the waking between sleeps is almost always the same. Still, quiet, one's own. People did not experience the darkness as absence. They experienced it as presence, as a portion of life that belonged to a different register than the day. Slower, more intimate, less defended. Your ancestors lived in that register for half of every night, for hundreds of thousands of years. It shaped how they spoke to the people they loved. It shaped how they processed grief and fear. It shaped how they created, because the hypnopompic state is the state from which the most vivid and strange imagery arises, the state that artists, writers, and inventors across history have described as the source of their most surprising ideas. Edison himself, famously, used to nap in a chair holding steel balls so that when he drifted into sleep the balls would drop, wake him, and he could capture whatever his transitional mind had produced. He did not know the neuroscience, but he knew the territory. What you have lost is not a charming historical practice. What you have lost is access to a part of your own mind, a part that was not optional, a part that was built into the structure of your nights for 300 millennia and then quietly bricked over in a single generation. The light is still on, the switch is right there, and the darkness that your brain was designed to live inside, half of every night, is now something most people only encounter by accident, during a storm, when the grid fails, when for a moment the world returns to what it was, and something in your chest goes very still and you don't quite know what to do with it. What if the thing your body is trying to do at 2 in the morning isn't malfunction? What if it's memory?